August 15, 1945. 3 months after victory in Europe, across the American heartland, prisoner of war camps prepared for the massive undertaking of repatriation, sending hundreds of thousands of German soldiers back across the Atlantic to their defeated homeland. But at a small facility outside Bloomington, Indiana, something unexpected was unfolding in the mess hall that would challenge everything a group of German women thought they knew about their enemies, about abundance, and about the possibility of life beyond war. When the first dinner bell rang at Camp Atterbury's Women's Auxiliary Section, 43 female prisoners filed into the dining hall, expecting the meager rations they had grown accustomed to during years of total war. What they encountered instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives, not with horror, but with wonder. Waltraud Huber, 24 years old and formerly of Munich, stood in the serving line with her metal tray extended, her eyes downcast in the posture of defeated compliance she had adopted since her capture in France 3 months earlier. The American cook, a heavy-set woman with flour dusting her forearms, placed something on Trottle's tray that made the young German woman's breath catch in her throat. A pork chop. Not a thin slice of mystery meat or a watery stew stretched to feed dozens, but an actual substantial pork chop, the meat thick and glistening with fat, seared to a golden brown, that released an aroma Trottle had not experienced in more than 4 years. But it was what the cook added next that caused Trottle to stop moving entirely, creating a backup in the serving line. With a large spoon, the American woman dolloped a generous portion of applesauce directly onto the plate beside the meat, the pale golden mixture settling into a small mound that caught the overhead lights. Fruit, real fruit. Not dried, not preserved in tiny rations, not hoarded like gold, but served casually, abundantly, as if apples were nothing more than a common accompaniment to an ordinary meal. Behind Trottle, 21-year-old Elfriede Meyer from Nuremberg whispered in German, her voice barely audible, "Is that apples? Fresh apples?" Her tone carried the same disbelief one might use when encountering something from a fairy tale, something that existed only in memory or imagination. Brunhilde Schmidt, 26 and the oldest of their small group from the Munich region, simply stared at her own tray when she received the same generous portions, her hands beginning to tremble slightly as years of rationing, of hunger, of making do with turnips and ersatz, everything collided with this impossible American reality. The youngest of their group, 20-year-old Rosemarie Fischer from Regensburg, accepted her tray and immediately turned to Trottle, with tears beginning to form in her blue eyes. "They're giving us fruit," she whispered in German, her voice cracking with an emotion none of them could quite name. "They're using fruit like it's nothing, like it's not precious, like there's more where that came from." To understand why applesauce could bring tears to the eyes of young women who had survived bombings, displacement, and capture, one must understand what hunger truly means. Not the missed meal of a busy day, but the grinding, constant deprivation that reshapes how a person sees the world, that transforms food from sustenance into an obsession, that makes every calorie a calculation and every meal a victory against despair. Trottle remembered the winter of 1943 in Munich with a clarity that never faded, no matter how much time passed. That was the year her ration card allowed her 200 grams of meat per week, often unavailable even with proper documentation. Her mother had developed an entire system of survival based on creativity born of desperation. Potato peels became the base for soup. Coffee came from roasted acorns that produced a bitter, brown liquid, bearing no resemblance to the real thing. Sugar existed only in memory and dreams. She recalled standing in line for 3 hours one February morning, her feet numb in boots worn thin, waiting for a delivery of bread that never arrived. The shopkeeper had simply shrugged, his own frame gaunt from the same deprivation, and suggested she return the following week. Perhaps there would be something then. Perhaps not. The uncertainty was worse than guaranteed hunger because it kept hope alive just enough to make each disappointment sharp and fresh. Frida's story was different in details, but identical in essence. In Nuremberg, her family had taken to eating Steck-Rübeneintopf, turnip stew, for dinner 6 nights out of 7. The 7th night they ate nothing, saving their rations for the week ahead. Her younger sister had developed a chronic cough that their doctor attributed to malnutrition, but there was no treatment available, no extra food to strengthen growing bones, no milk to soothe irritated throats. They simply endured and hoped she would survive until better times arrived. Hilda, coming from Augsburg, had worked in a munitions factory where the women received slightly better rations as essential workers, but slightly better still meant bread mixed with sawdust to extend the flour, margarine that tasted of chemicals, and meat that appeared perhaps once every 2 weeks. She had watched her co-workers grow thinner month by month, their faces becoming hollow, their movements slowing as bodies consumed themselves to survive. Some collapsed at their stations from sheer exhaustion and lack of nutrition. Young Rosie had perhaps the most haunting memories because she had been only 15 when the war began, meaning she had spent her entire adolescence hungry. She could barely remember what real chocolate tasted like, what butter looked like when it was not stretched with lard or substitutes, what it meant to finish a meal, feeling truly satisfied, rather than simply less desperately empty. Her growth had been stunted by years of insufficient nutrition, leaving her small and slight even now at 20. These were the women who stood in an American mess hall staring at pork chops and applesauce with disbelief and wonder. The 43 German women sat at long wooden tables in the Camp Atterbury mess hall, their trays before them like altars to an alien abundance they could not comprehend. Most had not yet touched their food, instead staring at the portions with expressions that ranged from suspicion to wonder to something approaching fear. Trottle watched as an American guard, barely 20 years old with red hair and freckles, dusting his sunburned nose, walked past their table and noticed their hesitation. He paused, genuine confusion crossing his features as he observed the untouched meals growing cold. "Something wrong with the chow?" he asked, his Midwestern accent thick and earnest. When none of the women responded immediately, he gestured at the nearest tray. "It's just pork chops and applesauce. Standard Wednesday dinner. Cook makes it every week." Just pork chops and applesauce. The casual dismissal of what these women considered an impossible luxury hung in the air between cultures, between worlds, between two completely different understandings of what constituted normal life. Frida, whose English was slightly better than the others from her work as a translator before the war, managed to find words. "Every week?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You eat like this every week?" The young guard shrugged, completely missing the weight behind her question. "Sure, Tuesdays we usually get meatloaf. Thursdays is fried chicken. Sundays we get pot roast if we're lucky. Why, what did you all eat back in Germany?" The question landed like a stone in water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence. How could they explain turnip soup and sawdust bread to someone who considered pork chops ordinary? How could they describe years of hunger to a boy who had clearly never missed a meal in his life, whose healthy frame and clear skin spoke of abundant nutrition from childhood onward? Hilda finally picked up her fork, her movement slow and deliberate, as if approaching something sacred that might disappear if handled too roughly. She cut a small piece of the pork chop, the meat separating easily under her knife, juices running onto the plate and mixing with the applesauce. She lifted the bite to her mouth and closed her eyes as she chewed. The fat, the seasoning, the texture of real meat rather than gristle and mystery scraps overwhelmed senses that had nearly forgotten such things existed. Tears began sliding down her cheeks as she chewed, swallowed, and immediately cut another piece. Around the tables, other women began to eat, and the mess hall filled with the strange sound of crying, mixed with the clink of forks against metal trays. Young Rosie ate her entire pork chop without pausing, then stared at the applesauce with something like reverence before taking her first bite of fruit in more than 2 years. The sweetness, the texture, the simple fact of apples being abundant enough to serve as a side dish rather than a rare treasure to be savored in tiny portions, broke something inside her that had been holding tight against hope. She put her head down on the table and sobbed while her body absorbed nutrition it desperately needed. The days that followed that first dinner revealed a pattern of abundance that the German women struggled to accept as reality rather than some elaborate temporary show designed to confuse or manipulate them. Each morning began with breakfast that would have fed a German family for an entire day. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, arrived in baskets piled high enough that some slices inevitably went uneaten and were simply discarded. Real butter, not margarine or lard-based substitutes, sat in small dishes at each table, available for anyone to use as liberally as they wished. Eggs appeared scrambled in large serving pans, their yellow richness speaking of chickens fed proper grain rather than scraps and desperation. Coffee, genuine coffee made from actual beans rather than roasted acorns or chicory, filled large urns that were refilled multiple times throughout the meal. Trottle found herself unable to waste anything during those first weeks, carefully finishing every crumb on her plate, using bread to soak up any remaining traces of eggs or gravy, treating each meal as if it might be the last abundance she would ever experience. But the American guards and kitchen staff seemed almost puzzled by such careful consumption, casually scraping half-eaten portions into waste bins without a second thought, pouring out coffee that had grown lukewarm, throwing away bread that had sat out for more than a few hours. The waste haunted Trottle in ways she could not fully articulate, even to her fellow prisoners. Each discarded slice of bread represented a day her family in Munich would have celebrated. Each cup of poured-out coffee symbolized a luxury her mother had not tasted in 5 years. Lunch brought sandwiches made with actual sliced meat, lettuce that was crisp and fresh rather than wilted and stretched, tomatoes that were ripe and abundant rather than carefully rationed. Frida watched one day as an American soldier made a sandwich, took 3 bites, decided he was not hungry after all, and simply threw the remainder away. She retrieved it from the waste bin when no one was looking, wrapped it carefully in a napkin, and hid it in her barracks, unable to bear the thought of such perfectly good food being destroyed. But when she returned to her hidden treasure hours later, she found it still there, unmolested, because there was no need for anyone to steal food in a place where more food would appear at the next meal without fail. Dinner continued the pattern of impossible plenty. Vegetables appeared, fresh rather than preserved or pickled. Fruit showed up not just as applesauce, but as whole apples, oranges, even bananas that Rosie had only seen in photographs before the war. Desserts materialized with shocking regularity, cakes and pies and cookies that used sugar and butter, with the kind of abandon that would have been criminal in wartime Germany. The women began to understand that America had fought an entire world war without its citizens ever experiencing the hunger that had defined European existence for half a decade. Kitchen duty assignments began in the 3rd week of the women's internment, and what camp administrators intended as routine labor distribution became something far more significant. Trottle and Frida found themselves assigned to work alongside the American kitchen staff, reporting each morning at 5 o'clock to help prepare breakfast for the entire camp population. The head cook, Staff Sergeant Mary Patterson from Valdosta, Georgia, was a woman in her mid-40s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had been cooking for crowds since childhood. She regarded her new German assistants with neither hostility nor excessive friendliness, simply the practical assessment of a professional evaluating potential help in her domain. The first morning, she handed Trottle a large bowl of eggs and a whisk, gesturing toward a massive mixing bowl. 50 eggs, she said in her thick southern drawl that Trottle struggled to understand. Scrambled. You know, scrambled? Trottle nodded, though 50 eggs represented more than her entire family's monthly ration back home. She cracked them carefully, treating each one with a reverence that made Sergeant Patterson pause in her own work and observed the young German woman's meticulous technique. "You cook before the war?" Patterson asked, her tone neutral but curious. "Yes," Trottle replied in halting English. "For my family. My mother, she teach me. But not with so much." She gestured at the abundance surrounding them in the kitchen, struggling to find English words adequate to express the contrast. "Not with eggs like this, not with butter, with cream, with meat. We have ration cards, very small amounts." Sergeant Patterson nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. "My boy's over in Germany right now," she said, continuing to work while she spoke. "Occupation forces. He writes me letters about what he's seeing there. Says people are eating grass and tree bark in some places. Says children follow soldiers begging for chocolate and crackers." She paused, then added, "I got no love for what your country did, what your leaders did, but I reckon young girls like you didn't have much say in it, and hunger's hunger no matter which side you fought on." The simple acknowledgement of their humanity, delivered in that matter-of-fact Southern accent, hit Trottle harder than any recrimination could have. Over the following weeks, the kitchen became a classroom where lessons extended far beyond cooking techniques. Frida learned how to make biscuits the Southern way, Sergeant Patterson guiding her hands through the process of cutting cold butter into flour until it resembled coarse crumbs, explaining that the secret was keeping everything cold and not overworking the dough. "My grandmother taught me this when I was about your age," Patterson said, watching Frida's careful movements. "She learned it from her grandmother. Food's about more than filling bellies. It's about passing things down, about showing people you care enough to feed them proper." She demonstrated her family's gravy recipe, a rich concoction of pan drippings, flour, milk, and black pepper that Trottle thought might be the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The apple orchards visible from the camp's western fence line became a focal point of Trottle's contemplation during the warm September afternoons. Rows upon rows of trees heavy with fruit stretched across the Indiana countryside, their branches bending under the weight of the harvest. American guards had mentioned casually that local farms were struggling to pick all the apples before they fell and rotted, that some orchards simply let portions of their crop go to waste because there was more fruit than the market could absorb. The concept was so foreign to Trottle's wartime experience that she initially thought she had misunderstood the English. Fruit going to waste, apples rotting on the ground because there were too many to pick. It contradicted everything she knew about scarcity, about value, about the fundamental nature of food as something precious and rare. One afternoon, Sergeant Patterson noticed Trottle staring out the kitchen window toward the orchards and followed her gaze. "Johnson Farm," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "They grow about 12 different varieties, make cider in the fall, sell apples at the market in town. Good people." She paused, observing Trottle's expression. "You thinking about them apples?" Trottle nodded, searching for the right English words. "In Germany, in Munich where I live, an apple is very expensive. Before the war, yes, we have apples sometimes, but during the war, an apple is like gold. My mother, she saved one apple for Christmas, 1943. One apple for 5 people to share. We each have one slice. It was the best gift." She turned to face Sergeant Patterson fully. "Here, you make applesauce like it is nothing. You put it with meat. You serve it every week. I do not understand how this can be." Sergeant Patterson set down the pot she had been scrubbing and leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "We got blessed with land here," she said slowly. "Good soil, good rain, space to grow things. My daddy used to say that America's greatest weapon wasn't our factories or our soldiers, it was our farmland. We could feed our people and still have enough to send food to our allies. The war never touched our crops, never bombed our fields, never took away our farmers beyond what we could spare." She gestured toward the orchards. "Those trees kept producing right through the war. Every fall, more apples than we knew what to do with. Some years, we made so much applesauce we gave it away to churches and schools because what else were we going to do with it?" The explanation illuminated something Trottle had been struggling to articulate even to herself. The applesauce was not just food, it was a symbol of everything that separated American experience from European suffering during the war. It represented land untouched by bombs, orchards that continued their seasonal cycles undisturbed, a food supply so robust that abundance rather than scarcity defined daily life. When Americans said pork chops and applesauce, they were speaking a language of plenty that had no translation in Trottle's German vocabulary. The Red Cross mail delivery arrived on a gray October morning, bringing with it the first substantial contact many of the German women had received from their families since before their capture. Camp administrators distributed the letters in the common room, calling out names in badly pronounced German that nonetheless carried the weight of connection to a world left behind. Trottle received 2 letters, both from her mother in Munich, the paper thin and fragile, the handwriting shaky in a way that spoke of either illness or extreme stress. She clutched them to her chest for a moment before finding a quiet corner to read, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread about what news they might contain. The first letter, dated July 26, 1945, began with assurances that her mother and younger sister had survived the final bombing raids and the chaos of occupation. But the remainder of the single page detailed a reality that made Trottle's comfortable existence in the Indiana camp feel like a betrayal. Her mother described standing in line for 4 hours to receive a ration of bread that amounted to 300 grams per person per week. She wrote about trading her wedding ring on the black market for 2 pounds of potatoes and a small amount of lard. She mentioned, almost casually, that Trottle's younger sister Sophie had fainted twice in the past month from hunger and that the American occupation authorities had established soup kitchens, but the portions were barely sufficient to sustain life, let alone restore health to a population that had been starving for months. The second letter, dated September 3rd, was shorter and more desperate. Her mother's handwriting had deteriorated further, the words occasionally trailing off or becoming illegible. She wrote about neighbors who had died from starvation-related illnesses, about children with distended bellies and hollow eyes, about women selling themselves to occupation soldiers for cigarettes they could trade for food. She begged Trottle, if possible, to send any food she could spare, any small amount that might help them survive the approaching winter. The letter ended with a line that would haunt Trottle for years to come. "We are so hungry, Liebchen, so hungry all the time. I dream about bread." Across the common room, similar scenes played out as other women absorbed news from home. Rosie sat with a letter from her aunt in Regensburg, tears streaming silently down her face as she read about her parents' deaths during the final weeks of the war, not from bombs, but from typhus contracted in their weakened, malnourished state. Frida learned that her younger sister's chronic cough had developed into tuberculosis, a disease that thrived among populations weakened by years of insufficient nutrition. Hilda discovered that her family home in Augsburg had been completely destroyed, and her parents were living in a displaced persons camp, surviving on whatever charity they could find. The contrast between their current reality and their family's suffering created a moral weight that pressed down on each woman differently but with equal force. November brought the first serious cold to Indiana, frost coating the windows of the barracks each morning and the apple orchard standing bare against gray skies. But inside Camp Atterbury's kitchen, preparations were underway for something the German women had never experienced, an American Thanksgiving. Sergeant Patterson had requested permission to include the female prisoners in the holiday celebration, arguing that teaching them American traditions was part of their eventual integration into civilian life, should they choose to remain in the United States. Camp administrators, uncertain about post-war policies but inclined toward gestures of reconciliation, approved the request. For 3 days leading up to the fourth Thursday in November, the kitchen became a hub of activity that would have seemed fantastical to women who had spent years managing scarcity. Trottle watched in astonishment as supplies arrived, 20-pound turkeys, not one or two, but enough to feed the entire camp population with leftovers guaranteed. Sacks of potatoes that would have fed her Munich neighborhood for a week. Fresh cranberries in quantities that seemed absurd for their intended purpose of making sauce. Pumpkins destined to become pies, their bright orange flesh representing a vegetable she had only read about in books. Sergeant Patterson moved through the preparations with the calm efficiency of someone orchestrating a familiar ritual, but she took time to explain each element to her German assistants. "Thanksgiving's about being grateful for what you have," she said, while demonstrating how to prepare the turkey for roasting. "My people started celebrating it a couple of hundred years back, after a hard winter when the natives helped them survive. Now it's about family, about coming together, about recognizing that we got more blessings than we probably deserve." Frida was assigned to help make stuffing, a concept that initially baffled her. "You put bread inside the bird?" she asked, watching Sergeant Patterson cube loaves of bread that were already a day old, and therefore, in the American system, no longer suitable for sandwiches. "Why not just eat the bread separate?" Patterson smiled, the first time Trottle had seen genuine warmth in the older woman's expression. "Because stuffing absorbs all the juices from the turkey while it cooks. Becomes something better than bread alone, better than turkey alone. That's what Thanksgiving's about, sugar. Things coming together to make something better than the parts." She added celery, onions, sage, and butter to the bread cubes with a generosity that made Frida's hands shake slightly as she mixed the ingredients. This single batch of stuffing contained more butter than her family had seen in 6 months. Hilda worked on sweet potato casserole, a dish so foreign to German cuisine that she required multiple explanations before understanding the concept. Sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows and brown sugar, baked until golden. It seemed less like food and more like candy, masquerading as a vegetable side dish. Young Rosie was tasked with rolling out pie dough, her small hands proving surprisingly adept at the delicate work. Sergeant Patterson had her make crusts for apple, pumpkin, and pecan pies, each one representing flavors and traditions the young German woman had never encountered. December 6, 1945, brought an announcement that forced the German women to confront the question they had been avoiding since Thanksgiving's abundant feast. Camp Commander Colonel Morrison called a mandatory assembly in the main hall, his weathered face serious as he stood before the 43 women who had spent the past 4 months in American custody. He held official documents from the War Department, their formal letterhead visible even from a distance. The room fell silent as he began to speak, a translator standing beside him to ensure every woman understood the weight of what was being communicated. "Ladies," Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of military command, tempered by something approaching compassion, "I have received orders regarding your repatriation to Germany. Transportation has been arranged for January 15th. You will be processed through displaced persons facilities in Bremen before being released to return to your homes or whatever remains of them." He paused, allowing the translator to finish, observing the complex emotions playing across the faces before him. "However," he continued, "the War Department has also authorized an alternative option. Given the unusual circumstances of your imprisonment and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, any woman who wishes to apply for displaced person status and potential immigration to the United States may do so. This is not a guarantee of permanent residence, but it opens a pathway that would allow you to remain here while your applications are processed." The implications of his words created a tension in the room that was almost physical. Return to a Germany of hunger, ruins, and uncertainty, or stay in America, where even prisoners ate better than most Europeans had during the entire war. For some women, the choice was immediate and clear. For others, the decision carried moral complexities that kept them awake through the night. Trottle spent 3 days wrestling with her conscience before requesting a meeting with Colonel Morrison. She brought with her the letters from her mother in Munich, their thin paper worn from repeated reading. "Sir," she began in careful English that had improved dramatically over 4 months, "I must ask you a question that shames me to speak." Morrison gestured for her to continue. "If I stay in America, if I choose this abundance over returning to help my family, does this make me a coward? Does this make me selfish?" The colonel was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Miss Huber, I cannot answer that question for you, but I can tell you that choosing survival is not the same as choosing cowardice. Your mother wants you to live, to have a future. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help when it is offered." That evening, Trottle gathered with Frida, Hilda, and Rosie in their barracks. The 4 women who had formed a tight bond over months of shared meals and kitchen duty now faced diverging paths. "I am going to request to stay," Trottle said quietly, her decision finally made. "My mother's letters tell me there is nothing to return to except hunger and ruins. Here, I can build something. Maybe someday I can bring her here too." 20 years after that December morning, when Trottle Huber chose abundance over return, she stood in the kitchen of her bakery on the north side of Indianapolis, her hands dusted with flour as she prepared the day's batch of Apfelkuchen, German apple cake made with Indiana apples so plentiful she could use them without guilt. The sign above her shop read, "Trottle's German Bakery, Traditional Recipes, American Ingredients," a motto that captured the synthesis of 2 worlds that had defined her adult life. Through the front window, she could see the morning customers beginning to gather, Americans who had developed a taste for authentic German baked goods, and German immigrants who came seeking flavors that reminded them of home, but made with the abundance that defined their adopted country. Her business partner and head baker, Elfriede Meyer, worked beside her preparing Streuselkuchen, her movements efficient and practiced. After 2 decades of professional baking, Frida had chosen to stay as well that December day, and together the 2 women had built something neither could have imagined during those first shocked meals at Camp Atterbury. They employed 6 people, served hundreds of customers weekly, and had recently opened a second location. More importantly, they had created a space where German traditions and American plenty merged into something new and sustaining. The recipes were authentic, passed down from grandmothers and mothers, but executed with ingredients those ancestors could never have afforded. Butter in abundance, eggs by the dozen, sugar measured in cups rather than carefully hoarded grams, and apples, always apples in every form imaginable. Brunhilde Schmidt had taken a different path, but one equally rooted in food and healing. She had pursued formal education in nutrition science, eventually becoming one of the first dietitians at Indianapolis Memorial Hospital. Her work focused on helping patients recover from illness through proper nutrition, and she brought to that work an understanding of hunger's long-term effects that few American-trained professionals could match. She published papers on the psychological impacts of wartime starvation and advocated for feeding programs that addressed not just caloric needs, but the emotional trauma associated with food insecurity. Her office walls displayed photographs from Camp Atterbury alongside her medical degrees, a reminder of where her journey toward healing had begun. Young Rosemarie Fisher had found her place on a farm in Brown County, Indiana, having married Thomas Wheeler, a veteran who had served in the occupation forces in Germany and understood what she had survived. Together, they ran an apple orchard, the irony not lost on Rosie that she now cultivated the very fruit that had symbolized American abundance during her imprisonment. She made applesauce every fall, hundreds of jars that she donated to churches, schools, and community centers, each jar a small act of gratitude for the second chance she had been given. Her children, 3 boys and 2 girls, grew up bilingual, speaking German at home and English everywhere else, embodying the bridge between cultures that their mother represented. The 9 women who had chosen to stay maintained connections across the years, gathering annually on Thanksgiving to recreate that first feast at Camp Atterbury when they had glimpsed the possibility of abundance without guilt.